In the grand and complex tapestry of the Bible, few peoples maintain a relationship as profoundly conflicted, as persistently antagonistic, and yet as intimately close with Israel as the Moabites. They are not a distant empire like Egypt or Babylon. They are neighbors, family, and a reflection of a shared, troubled past. Throughout the sweeping narrative of the Old Testament, we encounter them in a constant cycle of conflict and interaction. We see them as geographical neighbors sharing a border, as bitter military enemies warring for land and dominance, and perhaps most dangerously, as a constant source of profound spiritual problems for the chosen people of Israel. Their shared history is a turbulent one, filled with bloody battles, fragile and quickly broken alliances, and a deep-seated, persistent hostility that seems to define their very existence. But to truly grasp the depth of this animosity, to understand the spiritual significance of Moab in the biblical story, we cannot simply begin with their wars or their kings. We must journey back to their very origin, an origin story that stands as one of the most shocking, tragic, and emblematic in all of Holy Scripture. Their story does not begin, as so many national epics do, with the glorious founding of a great city or the divinely appointed feat of a heroic, pioneering king. It does not start with a promise or a blessing. Instead, the story of the Moabite people begins in the literal ashes and smoldering aftermath of one of God's most terrible and complete judgments, the utter destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The origin of the Moabite people is not just adjacent to this event. It is directly and inextricably tied to Lot, the nephew of the great patriarch Abraham. And more disturbingly, it is tied to a desperate, morally bankrupt, and sinful act committed in the darkness of a mountain cave, moments after Lot and his daughters fled the catastrophic rain of fire and sulfur. This foundation, a beginning born not of faith and promise, but of incest, trauma, deceit, and profound shame, cast a long and dark shadow over the destiny of the Moabites. It would indelibly mark their identity and their perpetually strained relationship with God and with their cousins, the nation of Israel. In fact, this tainted origin was so significant that the very law of Moses, given centuries later at Mount Sinai, would establish a severe and seemingly permanent prohibition against them. This law explicitly prevented them from ever becoming a part of God's holy people, the congregation of the Lord. However, it is precisely here, at this point of complete and final rejection, that we find one of the greatest and least understood mysteries of the Old Testament. Here lies a paradox that challenges our understanding of law, justice, and divine mercy. How is it possible? How can it be that a woman from this specific, forbidden, and cursed people, a Moabitess, was not only accepted into Israel, but ended up becoming a central, celebrated, and essential figure in the genealogy of Israel's greatest king, King David? And by that very extension, how did she find her place in the sacred lineage of Jesus Christ himself? Today we are going to embark on a deep and thorough examination of the complete story of the Moabites. We will begin in that dark cave, tracing their dark origin. We will follow their development as a nation, their hostile encounters with Israel, and the divine law that sealed their exclusion. And finally, we will arrive at their unexpected and pivotal role in the grand, overarching plan of salvation. What we are about to discover will teach us a profound and necessary lesson. It is a lesson about how God, in his infinite sovereignty, can work in ways that are mysterious and utterly contrary to human expectation. It is a lesson about how his grace is not just a theological concept, but an active, intervening force that can reach into the most broken of pasts, transforming even the most problematic and shameful origins to fulfill his glorious and eternal purposes. Our story begins in the aftermath of an apocalypse. After being warned by angels, Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters fled the wicked city of Sodom. They had just witnessed a judgment so complete, so terrifying, that it would be used as a benchmark for divine wrath for all of in history. They saw fire and brimstone rain from the sky, annihilating not just Sodom and Gomorrah, but all the cities of the plain. In this desperate flight, Lot's wife, disobeying the angel's specific command, looked back with longing for the life she was leaving. The judgment was instant. She became a pillar of salt. Lot and his 2 daughters were the only survivors from their city, and they were deeply traumatized. The text tells us they were afraid to stay in the small town of Zoar, the one place God had spared for them. So they went up from Zoar and took refuge in the mountains, living in a dark, isolated cave. They were utterly alone, cut off from the world, and their future was a blank, terrifying void. We must try to understand their psychological state. They had lost everything: their home, their community, their possessions, their fiancés, who had laughed at Lot's warning, and their mother. It was in this claustrophobic environment of desolation, trauma, and profound isolation that Lot's daughters, whose entire worldview and moral compass had been shaped and deeply corrupted by the depravity they had witnessed their whole lives in Sodom, made a terrible and calculated decision. Chapter 19 of the book of Genesis details their chilling reasoning. The older daughter said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is no man on earth to join with us, as is the custom of all the earth." This statement is key. In their minds, twisted by trauma and the apocalyptic scene they had just escaped, they may have genuinely believed that the judgment was global. They believed they were the last three people alive. There was no one else. Their logic, while deeply flawed and sinful, was one of pure pagan self-preservation. Their family line, and perhaps all of humanity, was about to be extinguished. So the older sister continued, "Come, let us give our father wine to drink, and let us lie with him, that we may preserve our father's descendants." This was not a spontaneous act of passion. It was a premeditated plan of deceit. For 2 consecutive nights they executed their plan. They made their father, Lot, so drunk that he was unaware of their actions. The first night, the older daughter lay with him. The second night, the younger daughter did the same. From this doubly incestuous union, 2 sons were born. These 2 sons would become the fathers of 2 nations that would be a perpetual thorn in Israel's side. Genesis 19 verse 37 tells us, "And the firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day." The name Moab is a play on the Hebrew words mi'av, meaning from my father. His very name was a permanent public declaration of his shameful origin. The next verse says, "The younger daughter also had a son whom she named Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day." His name, Ben-Ami, means son of my people, another direct reference to his incestuous conception. Thus, the Moabite people were not born of a divine promise, like Isaac. They were not the result of a covenant blessing, as was the case with Israel through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Their origin is indelibly marked by an act of profound sin, of calculated deceit, of intoxication, and of shame, all occurring in the darkness of a cave, born from the moral rot of Sodom. This problematic beginning is not a minor historical detail. The Bible presents it as the very foundation of their national identity. It would define so much of their future history, their national character, and their tense, hostile, and bitter relationship with their relatives, the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham's uncle. For centuries, the descendants of Moab grew and multiplied. They settled in the fertile lands east of the Dead Sea, displacing the Emim, a race of giants, and establishing a kingdom with its own culture, cities, and religion. Their chief god was Chemosh, a deity to whom, in times of great distress, they would even offer human sacrifices. Generations passed, and the Israelites, after their miraculous exodus from Egypt and their 40-year journey through the desert, finally arrived at the borders of the Promised Land. As they prepared to enter Canaan, their path took them to the plains of Moab, directly across the Jordan River from Jericho, and it was here they encountered this established, neighboring people. But instead of finding a welcome, or even neutrality from their distant kin, they found overwhelming fear and calculated hostility. The Bible shows us that the Moabites, terrified by this massive influx of people, tried to destroy Israel in 2 very different and strategic ways. First, when a frontal assault seemed too risky, they resorted to spiritual attacks. When that failed, they turned to a more insidious weapon, moral seduction. This first strategy is detailed in one of the Old Testament's most bizarre and fascinating narratives, found in the book of Numbers, chapters 22 through 24. Balak, the son of Zippor, was the king of Moab at that time. When he saw the sheer size of the Israelite camp, an immense multitude of people who had just utterly defeated the powerful Amorite kings Sihon and Og, he was filled with dread and sick with terror. He saw Israel as an existential threat, saying they would lick up all that is around us as an ox licks up the grass of the field. Instead of confronting them in a direct military battle, Balak decided to use a weapon he considered more powerful, a weapon of the supernatural. He decided to hire a mercenary to place a divine curse upon Israel. To do this, he and the elders of Midian sent messengers with the fees for divination in their hand to hire the services of the most famous seer of the time, a man named Balaam from Pethor on the Euphrates River. Balak's message was simple. Come now, curse this people for me, since they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them from the land. For I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed. Balaam is a complex figure. He is not an Israelite, yet he clearly communicates with Yahweh, the God of Israel. God came to him at night and explicitly told him, "You shall not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed." Balaam, though tempted by the promise of great riches and honor, at first refused. But Balak was persistent, sending more numerous and more honorable princes with an even greater offer. This time Balaam's greed got the better of him. While he piously said he could only speak God's word, he looked for a loophole. God, in his permissive will, told him to go, but to only speak what he commanded. Balaam saddled his donkey and went. But God's anger was kindled because he went. This is where the story takes its famous turn. In one of the strangest and most profound episodes in the Bible, an angel of the Lord stood in the path with a drawn sword, visible only to the donkey Balaam was riding. 3 times the donkey turned aside to save its master's life, and 3 times the unseeing Balaam beat the animal in anger. Finally, the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey, and it spoke to Balaam, rebuking him. Only then were Balaam's eyes opened to see the angel of God blocking his path. This entire event was a powerful, almost humiliating object lesson for the prophet. God had total control over the situation. If God could control the very voice of a mule, he could certainly control the words of a prophet. No human curse, no divination, and no amount of money could ever touch the people he had chosen and blessed. Frustrated but undeterred, King Balak tried to force the issue. 3 separate times he took Balaam to 3 different high places overlooking the Israelite camp, hoping a different vantage point would allow the curse to work. He built 7 altars and offered sacrifices of bulls and rams each time, and 3 times, when Balaam opened his mouth to pronounce the curse Balak had paid for, only words of profound and glorious blessing came out. He proclaimed, "How can I curse whom God has not cursed?" He declared, "Behold, I received a command to bless. He has blessed, and I cannot revoke it." Finally, instead of a curse, Balaam delivered a series of prophecies in favor of Israel, culminating in a famous messianic prophecy. "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel." The very man hired to destroy Israel ended up prophesying the coming of its ultimate king. Having failed spectacularly to curse Israel directly, the Moabites, along with their Midianite allies, did not give up. And it appears from later references in the Bible, Numbers 31-16, Revelation 2:14, that Balaam himself, angry that he missed out on his payment, gave Balak some new insidious advice. They turned to a much more subtle and far more dangerous tactic. If they couldn't defeat Israel from the outside with supernatural curses, they would try to corrupt them from within. Numbers, chapter 25, tells the tragic story of what happened at Baal Peor. The text is blunt. While Israel was staying in Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women. This was not simply a case of individual soldiers succumbing to temptation. It was a calculated, strategic, and religious trap. The text continues, "These women invited them to the sacrifices of their gods." This was a state-sponsored campaign of seduction. The Moabite women drew the Israelite men into their pagan rituals. And the Israelites, a people who had seen God's miracles in the desert for 40 years, not only accepted but ate from the offerings and bowed to worship their god, Baal of Peor. They fell headlong into the twin traps of idolatry and sexual immorality, two sins that were intrinsically linked in Canaanite fertility worship. This time, Israel had broken the first and most important commandment of their covenant with God. God's reaction was immediate and terrible. His holy anger was kindled against Israel. A deadly plague began to spread like wildfire throughout the camp, and thousands of people began to die. The plague only stopped when a faithful priest, Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, acted with zealous and violent righteousness. Seeing an Israelite prince brazenly bringing a Midianite woman into his tent in full view of Moses and the weeping congregation, Phinehas took a spear, followed them into the tent, and killed them both. This shocking act of judgment purified the camp of its open sin, and the plague was stopped. But not before 24,000 Israelites had died. This episode was a horrifying success for Moab. It showed that the greatest danger to Israel was not always the enemy armies they could see, but the spiritual seduction of idolatry and immorality, which could utterly destroy their relationship with God and nullify His blessing and protection. Thus, the Moabites established themselves in Israel's history not only as a military adversary, but as a constant and potent spiritual threat. They were a people whose influence, rooted in their own shameful origin and pagan worship, could lead Israel to complete ruin. And these hostile actions, both the attempt to curse and the successful seduction, would have a direct, lasting, and very severe consequence in the very law of God. The actions of the Moabites at this critical juncture, their hostile inhospitality, their malicious attempt to hire a curse against Israel, and their diabolical success in corrupting them morally at Baal-peor, were not forgotten by God. This was not just a bad memory in the history of Israel's journey. It became the basis for a specific, permanent law, a divine decree that would establish a formal and seemingly insurmountable barrier between the Moabites and the people of God. In the book of Deuteronomy, as Moses is giving his final instructions to the people before they enter the land, we find this compelling and severe law. In Deuteronomy 23 verses 3 and 4, God, through Moses, commands, "An Ammonite or a Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Even to their 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord forever." This is an incredibly strong and absolute prohibition. Let's analyze what it means. To enter into the congregation of the Lord meant far more than just attending a worship service. It meant being grafted into the covenant people. It meant they could not fully participate in the communal and religious life of Israel. They could not hold office. They could not intermarry. They could not be considered in any sense part of God's chosen family. And the phrasing, even to their 10th generation, forever, was meant to emphasize that this was not a temporary measure. This was not a short-term punishment. It was a perpetual separation. The Bible itself, in the very next verse, explains exactly why this law was so severe. Verse 4 continues, "Because they did not come to meet you with bread and water on the way, when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired Balaam the son of Beor from Pethor of Mesopotamia against you to curse you." The text also notes that God refused to listen to Balaam and turned the curse into a blessing. God did not forget their cold-hearted lack of hospitality to their own kin, who were weary travelers in the desert. And above all, He did not forget their malicious, premeditated attempt to use a spiritual curse to destroy His chosen people. The incident at Baal-peor, which followed, only cemented this national character of corruption. From a faith perspective, this law was not an act of arbitrary cruelty or ethnic hatred by God. It was, first and foremost, a direct and just consequence of Moab's own hostile actions. And secondly, it was a necessary protective measure for Israel. God was setting a clear, legal, and spiritual boundary. He was placing His people in a form of spiritual quarantine, protecting the purity of their faith and the integrity of their covenant. He was keeping them away from the demonstrably idolatrous and morally corrupting influence of their neighbors. This was, in a sense, an act of severe mercy to protect the lineage and the plan of salvation. So, with this divine law, the fate of the Moabites seemed irrevocably sealed. They were a people marked by their shameful origin in a cave, defined by their persistent hostility, and now formally excluded by a divine law that barred the door to them forever. The door to the congregation of God, the door to the covenant, seemed to have been slammed shut, locked, and decreed by the very hand of God. It seemed like a closed case, a final and eternal separation. But as we are about to see, God's plan is always bigger, always more mysterious, and infinitely more merciful than any law by itself could ever suggest. Because it is right in the middle of this story of judgment, rejection, and eternal separation that God was preparing to plant the seed of one of the most beautiful and world-changing redemption stories in all of the Bible. For centuries, the law in Deuteronomy 23:3 stood as the final word on the Moabites, a closed door, an eternal separation. It was the law of God. But God's plan is always deeper and more complex than our most literal interpretations of his law. And to prove this, he chose one of the darkest, most chaotic, and most morally bankrupt periods of Israel, is history, to tell a story that seems to come from another world entirely. This was the time of the Judges, a bloody era summarized by the phrase, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." It is in this pit of spiritual darkness that God gives us a small 4-chapter book, a story of famine, loss, love, loyalty, and ultimately, profound redemption. It is the story of Ruth, the Moabitess. The story, which we find in the book of Ruth, begins with a painful irony. Due to a severe famine in Bethlehem, a town whose name, Beit Lechem, literally means house of bread, there was no bread. An Israelite family, led by a man named Elimelech and his wife Naomi, does the unthinkable. To survive, they go to seek refuge in the one land that was supposed to be off-limits. They move to the land of Moab, the forbidden land. There, the story turns tragic. Elimelech dies, leaving Naomi a widow. Her 2 sons then marry Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other named Ruth. Then, after about 10 years, both of Naomi's sons die as well. Naomi is left alone, a bitter widow without a husband or children in a foreign land. She is accompanied only by her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law. Upon hearing that the famine in her homeland had finally ended, Naomi decided to return to Bethlehem. With a generous but completely broken heart, she told her daughters-in-law to go back to their own mothers' homes in Moab so they could remarry and have a future. It was the logical, sensible, and compassionate thing to do. Orpah, crying, kissed her mother-in-law and said goodbye. She returned to her people and to her gods. But Ruth clung to Naomi and refused to leave her. And it is here, in Ruth's response to Naomi, that we find one of the most beautiful and significant declarations of faith and loyalty in all the Bible. She says to Naomi, and we must read this in Ruth 1 verses 16 and 17, "Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from following you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death separates me from you." Let us carefully analyze what is happening in these words. This is so much more than the affection of a daughter-in-law for her mother-in-law. Ruth, the Moabitess, is making a covenant oath. She is performing a full radical conversion. She is renouncing her land. Wherever you go, I will go. She is renouncing her people. Your people shall be my people. And most importantly, she is renouncing her gods, such as Chemosh, to embrace the one true God, Yahweh as her God, and your God my God. This is a total, voluntary act of faith. It is a conversion that springs not from a command, but from a heart that has been transformed by the love and the testimony of the God she saw, even in the midst of tragedy, in her Israelite family. With this powerful decision, Ruth, the foreigner from the forbidden people, the descendant of Moab, voluntarily and decisively chose to join the people of the covenant. She was not joining by her bloodline, which was cursed, but by a decision of faith in her heart, which was pure. And so the 2 widows, Naomi, the Israelite woman, empty and embittered by life, and Ruth, the Moabitess, full of a new and radical faith, set out together on the road back to Bethlehem. They didn't know what awaited them. They were poor, unprotected, and returning as outcasts. But Ruth's profound act of faith and loyalty had set in motion a divine plan. It was a plan that would not just break down barriers, but would ultimately change the entire history of salvation forever. Ruth's arrival in Bethlehem with Naomi raises the critical question that hangs over this entire story. If the law of God in Deuteronomy 23 was so clear, so absolute, in prohibiting the Moabites from ever entering the congregation of Israel, how is this possible? How is it possible that this story not only happens but is celebrated, canonized, and held up as an example of godliness in the Bible? The answer to this profound paradox is one of the most beautiful and central lessons about the very heart of God. It is the mystery of grace. The story of Ruth and the Moabites teaches us perhaps the most important and life-changing lesson in all of the Bible. God's grace is infinitely more powerful than our past. It is more powerful than our origins, more powerful than our laws, and more powerful than any curse. The sin of a cave in Sodom's shadow seemed to define the fate of an entire people, but the faith of one woman in a barley field in Bethlehem changed the course of salvation history forever. The law of God is holy, just, and good. It shows us His perfect standard and the dire consequences of sin. But the case of Ruth, the Moabitess, reveals to us the heart behind the law. It reveals that God has always valued a converted heart and a sincere, trusting faith over any national origin, any bloodline, or any past sin. Ruth shows us that God does not judge nations as one inseparable doomed block. His mercy is always and forever available to the individual soul who turns to Him in humility and faith. The story of Moab is the story of God taking the very worst of our human shame and, through His incomprehensible grace, weaving it into the most beautiful and glorious tapestry of His eternal plan.